I still remember the heat, baking the unpaved streets of Oak Creek in the summer of 1952, when the sun beat down on our light blue general store and turned the dust into little golden clouds with every passing car. It was the kind of town where you waved at strangers on the sidewalk, where men tipped their hats to Mrs. Garrett as she swept her porch, and where Sunday mornings meant church bells, hasty potlucks, and gossip drifting through the open windows of the 4 wooden pews. You could feel the pulse of community in every handshake, every whispered prayer, every shared loaf of cornbread. That same pulse could also carry secrets, deep, dangerous secrets, hidden behind polite smiles. In those days, Miller's Mercantile was more than just a shop. It was our living room, our news centre, our town square. Mr. Miller, my father, ran it like a man conducting an orchestra. His broad shoulders filled out his linen shirts perfectly, and his slicked-back hair always held its shape, even in the humidity. From dawn until dusk, he welcomed neighbours who came for groceries, motor oil, fabric, or advice. He'd measure sacks of sugar on an old brass scale that sang a metallic note each time it settled. He'd lean forward, elbows resting on the well-worn counter, and ask, "How are the Johnsons doing down on Elm?" Or, "Can I offer you a soda on the house?" His voice was warm, his grin wide. He did more business in goodwill than in dollars. But if you'd asked anyone in Oak Creek whether a man who wore Sunday best and preached kindness on the corner could be capable of real evil, they would have laughed politely and said, "That's not our Richard Miller." Our town believed in the sanctity of family above all else. The church taught us that a man who provided for his household, who carried his Bible and served communion, was beyond reproach. Honor thy father and thy mother wasn't just a commandment, it was a shield against suspicion. To question a family's holiness was to invite scandal. So most folks chose comfort over curiosity, silence over intervention. I was 10 when I first realized just how dangerous that silence could be. Our house, a simple 2-bedroom frame set behind the store, smelled of coffee grounds and old books. My mother, fragile as a candle in the wind, spent her days in pale blue dresses, drifting between bedsheets and small doses of nervous medicine. Charlotte, 2 years younger, moved through the rooms with shy eyes, like she was expecting thunder to break at any moment. Emily, the baby of the family, laughed in bright chirps, her rosy cheeks lighting up every corner of our gloom. If Miller's Merc was the heart of town, our home was its echo. Empty plates clattering in the kitchen, the faint hum of church hymns drifting through the cracked window. And out there, behind the polite storefront, a different melody played. It was a rhythm of fear and control. Low voices in forbidden rooms, footsteps gliding down darkened halls. A child's breath held too long in frozen terror. American small towns in the 1950s were built on trust. You trusted your neighbor to watch your back. You trusted your pastor to guide your soul. You trusted your leader to protect your daughters. But trust is a double-edged sword. When someone betrays it, the wounds go deeper. We had no idea that the man who greeted Mrs. Peters with a handshake each morning would be the same man whose shadow haunted our bedrooms at night. We had no way to imagine that a community so tightly woven could unravel piece by piece behind closed doors. Back then, there was no phone number to dial for help. There were no Child Protective Services vans rolling down Main Street, no anti-abuse hotlines flashing on tin roof radios, no psychologists trained to read the scars under a child's fingernails. If you were desperate enough to speak, you risked being labeled a liar, a troublemaker, a disobedient child. And if your word competed against that of a pillar of your church, guess who won? The one with the spotless reputation. That's why the silence crept in like water through the cracks of our foundation, seeping into every corner of our lives. No one asked questions when my father insisted I close the store alone at dusk. No one noticed how I flinched when a hand lingered on my shoulder to help me relax. No one batted an eye when he said quietly in the hush after closing, "Don't say a word, or your mother will be ill again." When I was 13, I learned the first rule of Oak Creek appearances matter more than truth. If you want to survive here, you learn to nod and smile, to keep your head down, to pretend that everything is fine. And for all the folks who tipped their hats and chatted about the weather, not one took a second look at my trembling hands or the shadows under my eyes. I didn't know then how common our story was. I didn't know that in 1952, across America, thousands of children lived behind closed doors with threats louder than any sermon. The culture of the time told girls to be seen and not heard, to respect their elders without question, to take no for an answer when authority spoke. But when that authority became the source of danger, the rules that were meant to protect us turned into prison bars. Today we have research to tell us that nearly 80% of child sexual abuse survivors waited years before telling anyone, often because they knew they would not be believed. We have organizations like the Rape, Abuse and Incest National Network offering confidential support. We have mandatory reporting laws that compel teachers, doctors and social workers to speak up. We have hotlines 888-373-7888 in the United States, where trained professionals listen without judgment. Yet in 1952, our only option was silence, and silence protected the monster behind our front door, not the girl hiding in the closet. I share this now not for pity, but for clarity. When you stitch together the fabric of a small town, its stores, its churches, its schools, you're really weaving threads of trust, safety, faith. But if one of those threads is rotten, the whole tapestry becomes fragile. My story began in a place that prided itself on looking out for one another, and yet the very features that built our community, our refusal to pry our deference to authority, our fear of scandal, created the perfect hiding place for the worst kind of betrayal. In the warm glow of our living room lamp, I would lie awake listening to the steady creak of the porch swing outside, wondering how many other families hid their horrors behind closed doors. I would dream of a world where a little girl could run to her neighbors for help without shame. I would pray for a dawn when the church bells didn't have to ring for funerals, but for healing. That was the world I wanted, a world where a kind face behind the counter meant genuine kindness, where a father's embrace didn't feel like a trap, where a community could promise, "I'll always watch your back," and actually keep that promise. I didn't have the words then to ask for that world. I only had a trembling heart and the seed of a plan that would grow long after this first chapter. But before I could fight to change my own fate, I had to understand how I had been silenced. And that meant learning the hard truth: trust without accountability is a lie, and silence without choice is a prison. It took me years to find my voice in Oak Creek, and in those dusty summers by the general store. I swore that if I ever broke free, I would shout until the whole world heard. I learned far too painfully that abuse is never a single moment, but a series of calculated steps. It begins almost imperceptibly, a hand on your shoulder that lingers a beat too long, a gentle compliment about how you're growing into a beautiful young woman, the lowering of precautions in otherwise innocent-seeming situations. In Oak Creek, my father mastered that dance. He groomed me with the same patient precision he used to order supplies for his store, careful, methodical, always hiding his true intent. First came the isolation. He'd send the other employees home early, saying Abby can handle the register herself, then close the door to the warehouse behind us. In a place filled with the aroma of coffee and grain, I would be alone with him counting bills and trying not to look down at the creases in the ledger. The warehouse walls were thick with sacks of sugar and flour, muffling any sounds, wrapping us in a private world he controlled. Next, there were small favors, an allowance here, a praise there that made me feel needed and grown up. I was learning bookkeeping with Mr. Evans, gaining knowledge most girls my age never would, and that gave me a strange pride. But it also made me vulnerable. I wanted his approval, his smile, even when it meant obeying his unspoken demands. Then the compliments turned personal. Your hair smells like jasmine. Your legs look strong, perfect for modeling someday. Each sentence felt benign on its own, but strung together, they formed a net I could not escape. At every turn, he tested the boundaries. A brush of fingertips against my arm. A helpful massage after a long day closing up the store. Finally came the threats. He whispered in my ear, voice low and dangerous, "Tell anyone and your mother will die. It will all be your fault." He knew his reputation in Oak Creek protected him, a respected shopkeeper, an upstanding churchgoer who could dare accuse him. If I spoke out, I would be branded a liar. My mother, fragile and medicated, would crumble. The legacy of honor thy father would smother any plea for help. And so the grooming cycle repeated. I would become compliance itself, doing whatever I could to avoid those icy stares and veiled warnings. In the hours my father chose, I was no longer his daughter, but a worker in his hidden enterprise of cruelty. Outside, the familiar routines carried on: afternoon church services, jovial card games at the barber shop, families sharing ice cream on the porch. Oak Creek made it easy to pretend nothing was wrong. Behind closed doors, though, I learned to recognize the signs in others. The way Mrs. Garcia tightened her grip on her purse when she spoke of her husband's sudden anger. The way young Brenda, whose father owned the dry goods a few blocks away, refused to join the neighborhood picnic. Her eyes flicking anxiously toward her own front door. I sensed that, like me, they too were hiding something dark. I tried once more to reach out to my mother, to Mr. Evans, to the local reverend, but each time I attempted to name my fear, I was rebuffed. My mother. Your father only wants what's best. Mr. Evans, too shy, too polite to pry. Reverend Brown, honor and obey. Children shouldn't question their parents. They turned away not from disbelief alone, but from the heavy burden of action. They feared scandal more than they feared cruelty. This reaction is not unique. Experts at the Rape, Abuse and Incest National Network RAIN describe grooming in 4 stages: bonding, control, desensitization, and secrecy. He bonded with me by flattering my intelligence and offering special privileges. He asserted control by isolating me and weaponizing my love for the family. He desensitized me to touch by making it feel benign at first. And he commanded secrecy by threatening my mother's health and my own safety. In Oak Creek's close-knit culture, secrecy came easy. Neighbors saw me carrying groceries or sweeping the sidewalk without a second glance. They chalked up the occasional odd behavior, my sudden withdrawals, my nervous shakes to girlhood, or picking up bad habits. They assumed I was simply shy, or that a bit of timidity was normal for a shopkeeper's daughter. They clung to their comforting narratives, unable or unwilling to consider the nightmare behind the closed doors of Miller's Mercantile. There was a shining irony in the fact that the very system meant to protect children, family loyalty, community reputation, religious authority, became the system that failed me. In more modern terms, this is known as the bystander effect. People are less likely to intervene when others are present, diffusing the sense of personal responsibility. Here, though, it was magnified by a fear of rocking the boat, of challenging one of the town's pillars. I wasn't alone in that silence. A 2018 case from rural Texas made headlines when a young girl finally spoke up after years of abuse by her uncle, a respected deacon at her church. Her teacher noticed bruises, but fearing defamation, said nothing. Her pastor counseled her to pray more. By the time authorities acted, the trauma had become irreversible. Our stories, though decades apart, share a painful pattern. The very people and institutions we trust turn away rather than see the worst. In each rejection, I learned a harsh lesson. In Oak Creek, rumors died quickly, but shadows lingered forever. If I wanted to protect myself, and one day my sisters, I would have to become my own advocate. I trained my eyes to spot the red flags in others beyond my father's reach. I saw Mrs. Thompson at the school, whose son refused to come home after a weekend with his father. I saw Mr. Dearne Jenkins, the barber, whose usually jovial laugh had a brittle edge whenever his wife mentioned their happiness. I catalogued these moments in my head, storing them like evidence until they felt too numerous to ignore. Yet even as I gathered proof in my mind, the pitfalls were clear. I could go to the county sheriff, but he would naturally believe the shopkeeper who kept the town running. I could speak to Child Protective Services, but in 1950s Ohio, such an agency was untested and underfunded, more theoretical than practical. I could call the church elders, but they would close ranks, worried more about gossip than justice. The common mistakes children make in these situations are easy to list. They stay silent out of fear. They confide in the wrong people. They spin stories that seem too incredible to be true. But the truth is, that abusers rely on these mistakes. They count on your confusion, your loyalty, your love for them. They assume that authority will protect them, that silence will shield them. This is why in those suffocating years, I built a private map of hope. I whispered to Charlotte and Emily when no one else was listening. We watch out for each other always. We never leave each other alone. We agreed on signals, a sudden cough, a dropped book. Anything to warn that he was near. We became each other's safe houses. Looking back, I see how the failures of Oak Creek's system shaped me. It taught me to distrust comforting facades, to read fear behind forced smiles. But it also taught me the power of self-reliance and the necessity of forging my own path to safety. I didn't yet know how I would fight back, but I knew that I would. Even if everyone else refused to see, I would not turn away from the shadows any longer. That realization was a turning point. It set me on the path toward the only justice I could imagine, a justice carried out by my own hands. The system had failed me, but somehow I would find a way to make it right. Before I could plan my next move, though, I needed knowledge. Knowledge of the store's hidden finances. Knowledge of my father's secrets. Knowledge of the powerful men he owed money to. I would have to learn bookkeeping not just for the public ledgers, but for the clandestine ones he hid under lock and key. But those lessons would come in time. First, I solidified my alliance with Charlotte and Emily. First, I hardened my resolve against the silence that had protected my father for so long. And first, I acknowledged that my dignity, my safety, and my sisters' lives depended on breaking free of the patterns of grooming and the apathy of Oak Creek's so-called protectors. I spent every spare moment buried in the ledger books, learning not just how my father recorded sales, but how he hid the real numbers from prying eyes. By the time I was 16, I could recite the store's financial heartbeat in my sleep. The exact cost of a sack of flour, the markup on coffee beans, the monthly rhythm of shipments from Chicago. I devoured every journal entry, every supplier invoice, until the secrets began to reveal themselves like footprints in fresh snow. Mr. Evans had taught me the ordinances of accounting, how to balance debits and credits, how to reconcile discrepancies. But what I discovered in the hidden drawer was the art of deception. My father kept 2 sets of books, the official set he showed suppliers, and the local tax collector, and the shadow set he hid under a false bottom in his office desk. In the official books, last month's profits were listed at $300. In the shadow set, they rang in at £1,200. The difference, pocketed quietly and added to his debt to Tony Gallo, financed his late-night trips to Detroit and his whispered rendezvous with women he'd never speak of in the light of day. Most children my age would have found math dull, but for me, it was freedom. With each entry I memorized, I felt a little less trapped. I began to sketch diagrams in the margins, linking official entries to their shadow counterparts, mapping out exactly where the money disappeared and how it resurfaced. I noted that every lost sack of rice corresponded to a day my father arrived home with the sour scent of whiskey on his breath. I marked the days Tony's driver Clyde pulled into the lot, signs of mounting pressure. At home, I turned these private notes into a secret language. In my journal, I wrote, "Ordered 50 PREJUDICEs. Coffee only 20 recorded. Difference $30. Or invoice number 314, forged in my handwriting, same typeface, untraceable." I tested my skills by creating phantom invoices for supplies that had never arrived, tucking them among the real stacks to see how they might catch a skilled eye. I learned to match the ink's shade, the printer's imperfection, the supplier's scrawl. All the while, I had an unexpected ally in Martha the cook, who came 3 times a week to prepare meals for the store employees. She was a widow with greying hair and hands that smelled of rosemary and sage. Nobody in Oak Creek dared question Martha. She had a quiet authority, perhaps born of years tending to wounds both physical and emotional. One afternoon, when I was hiding behind the kitchen door, clutching my notes, she found me and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You look burdened, child," she said. Voice soft but steady. Even the strongest horse stumbles under a heavy load. I shook my head, tears threatening. "It's nothing," I mumbled. She didn't press. Instead, she offered me a biscuit and a glass of milk. And then, as if deciding to trust a rare secret, she leaned close and whispered, "The weeds in this garden grow deep roots. Sometimes the only cure is to pull at the root, no matter how painful." Her words lit a spark. I realized I couldn't just passively gather evidence. I had to use it. I began slipping key documents to Martha, copies of shadow book pages, blank check stubs, hand-typed notes detailing my father's omissions. She would glance them over in the kitchen, nod once, then slip them away to her private cupboard. Later, she told me she'd delivered the copies to a man she trusted in the next town, someone who knew how to expose fraud without drawing direct attention to a teenage girl. Every evening after Charlotte and Emily fell asleep in their shared room, I would crouch by the window and plan. I had to make sure Tony Gallo knew the 2-book scheme. He was the only man in Oak Creek who would care, and who had the means to retaliate. In the silence of the night, I whispered the plan to the dark forge, a letter to Tony anonymous, but detailed, instruct him how to verify the fraud, leave the evidence in plain sight. Then slip away before the consequences fell back on me. Of course, the risks were enormous. I could have made a single typo and tipped my hand. I might have left fingerprints on the envelope, or been spotted by Clyde, driving the letter to Tony's Cadillac. And if Tony questioned my story instead, he would unleash fury, perhaps not on my father, but on me and my sisters. Yet when weighed against the danger my father posed to Emily, the risk felt justified. Every moment I hesitated, I felt my heart pound as if it would burst. To sharpen my technique, I studied famous cases of financial fraud. The Enron collapse loomed large even in rough outlines I found in old newspapers. I learned how professional forgers matched paper grain and ink density, how they imitated signatures until the curve of a letter felt second nature. I took those lessons and practiced them by candlelight, forging a fake deposit slip that mimicked the store's bank forms, stamping it with a dented seal I carved from soft wood. When the night came to deliver the letter, Martha helped me prepare. She distracted my father in the kitchen, complaining about a burned roux, while I slipped across the store floor with the envelope stashed in my apron. I watched the oil lamp flicker as I placed it on Tony's driver's seat during one of his delivery stops, a simple flourish, but one that ensured the message would be found immediately. The envelope bore the words, typed in a stilted hand, "Mr. Gallo Richard Miller has been cheating you for years. Check the hidden books under his desk. He's pocketing thousands." Then I slipped back into the shadows and ran home. My bones felt hollow with adrenaline, but my pulse sang with defiance. For the first time in years, I believed I could take control. Days later, the fallout arrived on a humid Thursday evening. Word spread that Tony had stormed through the back door of Miller's Mercantile, demanded to see the hidden records, and emerged with Clyde's men in tow. What happened next was murky stories ranged from a heated confrontation to a brutal reckoning in the warehouse. All I know is that by morning my father's shadow sat empty beside the ledger desk. No one asked questions beyond, "What happened, and is the store still open?" Tony's name was whispered with grudging respect. "He doesn't let anyone cheat him," townsfolk said, shaking their heads. They assumed it was a business dispute, a warning shot, nothing more. And they moved on. In Oak Creek, life went on. In the hush that followed, I felt a peculiar mixture of triumph and sorrow. I had saved my sisters and myself from immediate danger, but at what cost? The store's doors remained open, but its heart had been ripped out. My father did not walk through those glass panes again. On the day I found the shadow books thrown into a pile on the warehouse floor, I experienced the raw ache of loss, not for the man he had been, but for the innocence stolen from all of us. In the coming weeks, I learned another lesson. Justice can be swift, but healing takes time. My sisters and I were forced to adjust to a new normal. No father at the dinner table, no man's voice thundering through the hall. Instead, we had Martha's quiet presence, the steady hum of the register and each other. We moved forward, piecing together our lives, step by step, book by book. Looking back now, I see that those months of covert accounting and clandestine alliances were more than just a teenage rebellion. They were the foundation of everything I would build, later my refuge, Sunrise House, and the support network for girls in need. I discovered that knowledge is power, that even in the darkest situations, you can find an ally, and that bold action, carefully planned, can topple even the most entrenched abuse. But I also carry the weight of having sparked a chain of events that led to violence. It's a burden I've wrestled with my whole life. I still wonder if there was another way, a less dangerous method to protect my sisters. Yet every time doubt creeps in, I remember the terror in Emily's eyes the night she realized her father would come for her next. And I know without hesitation that I would do it again. I'll never forget the morning I first heard the county sheriff's cruiser roll up to Miller's Mercantile. I was shelving jars of peach preserves when Sheriff Daniels stepped through the door, all 8 crisp silver stars on his chest, gleaming under the store lights. He cleared his throat and looked at me. "Miss Abby, Mr. Miller's daughter, I presume." I nodded, heart in my throat. He shifted his weight brow, furrowing. I expected questions about the confrontation with Tony Gallo the other night. But instead, he said, "We need to talk about your father's death." The words landed like stones in my stomach. Death. The echo of it still haunted me. I set down the jar I was holding and pointed toward the ledger desk. I can show you the books, Sheriff." He followed me back to the office, eyes scanning the floorboards for stains or splinters, as if the grain of the wood could tell the story. He didn't ask how I knew how to balance those ledgers so precisely. He didn't question why I was the one managing the store's finances, not Mr. Henderson. He simply said, We heard an unknown man forced his way in, and your father came out. Gone. We've got no body, no weapon, no forensics, just a missing person and a collection of rumors. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. Tony Gallo did this, I said. Voice small, but steady. He found the hidden records and took justice into his own hands. Sheriff Daniels sighed and removed his hat. That's vigilante justice, Miss Abby. In the eyes of the law, no matter how rotten your father was, no one has the right to kill him without due process. I remembered every moment of that night. The dark warehouse, the muffled shouts, the gleam of a terrible finality in Tony's eyes. I felt my chest tighten. Sheriff, it wasn't a simple misunderstanding. My father was a monster. He would have hurt us, Emily, especially if someone hadn't acted. He studied me, expression guarded. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice. I understand you've been through hell here. But the law is the law. If Tony's men harmed your father, that's a criminal act. I have to pursue it regardless of motive. That moment crystallized for me the unyielding tension between justice and the law. Oak Creek had taught me that sometimes the law fails the vulnerable. Yet when someone steps outside the law to protect them, that person becomes a criminal too. It was a paradox I wrestled with late into the nights when the store was closed, sitting on the threshold, with the crickets chirping like a relentless jury. In those days, Ohio statutes did recognize justifiable homicide in defense of life. But the burden of proof was monumental, especially when your only witness was a teenage girl whose father had a reputation to the contrary. Prosecuting Tony Gallo for murder would require evidence I couldn't supply: a body, a weapon. Credible third-party testimony. He'd deny everything. His men would spread rumors. They'd call me a conniving child who lied to get rid of a pesky father. And in those collective whispers, as though my sisters and I would be the ones left vulnerable again. I thought back to what I'd learned in civics class about due process, the presumption of innocence, the sanctity of a jury trial. In principle, it was beautiful. The idea that everyone, even the vile, deserved a chance to explain. Yet for me, the principle had offered no protection as when I was 14, sobbing behind the store counter. It had barred me from help when I needed it most. The law in Oak Creek had favored reputation over reality, ritual over rescue. Around that same time, I stumbled upon a 1935 case in the state archives. A father in neighboring Wayne County had confessed to luring his own daughter into the barn and abusing her. The community was outraged. Yet when the local deputy confronted him, the man was released on bail, pleaded temporary insanity, and walked free months later. The headlines called it a family tragedy, the same phrase the Oak Creek Gazette used for every scandal it preferred to gloss over. I clutched the brittle newspaper clipping and felt a fierce knot of anger. The law had failed that girl too. I shared the clipping with Mr. Thompson, my lawyer in Chicago, who had helped secure my guardianship. He frowned at the yellowed paper thumb, tracing the jagged edges. This case shows how the system can be manipulated, he said. Insanity. Please, shady bail deals. Powerful men have many ways to slip through the cracks. But vigilantism comes with its own perils. You could find yourself fighting a battle you can't win. He was right. I could not build my life on another body in the warehouse, another secret burying a story that needed to see the light. I owed it to Charlotte and Emily not to be consumed by revenge. I needed a stable foundation, one rooted in law, not violence. In that struggle, I realized how easy it is for communities to romanticize vigilante acts in the name of justice. The Texas case from 2018 had its own echo public opinion rallied behind a family friend who had shot the girl's uncle, convinced that was the only way to save her. We'll let the law sort it out later, they said. But I knew sorting out often meant silent suppression, or worse, no action at all. So I chose a different path. Rather than pursue Tony in the shadows, I built something in the light. I took the insurance money my father had paid for the store, a bitter irony that hired Mr. Thompson to help me establish a legal non-profit. We called it Sunrise House, a refuge for girls who had nowhere else to turn. We would shelter them, counsel them, and when the law failed, teach them how to navigate it. In the beginning, Sunrise House was little more than a spare room behind the store with a sofa bed and a stack of donated books. Charlotte helped with cooking. Emily brought her rag doll for comfort. We listened to stories, each girl's voice trembling with the same fear I'd known, and offered blankets, warm soup, and above all, an open ear. And when a story sounded dangerously unresolved, we guided them to lawyers, social workers, or the sheriff's office, anywhere that might help. We learned from our mistakes. We developed partnerships with Child Protective Services in multiple counties, so no girl would slip through the gaps as I had. We trained volunteers to recognize signs of grooming, to file mandamus letters for expedited hearings, to advocate for emergency orders of protection. We created a small legal fund that paid for court fees, witness appointments, or DNA tests when needed. Over time, Sunrise House grew beyond that spare room. In 1974, with seed money from friends and sympathetic donors in Chicago, we purchased a larger house a few blocks from the subway line. A battered sign hung out front, Sunrise House. The letters were uneven, but they shone in the early morning light, promising safety to any girl who spotted them. We didn't ignore the law. We embraced it, molded it into a shield instead of a blade. We taught girls that their voices mattered in a courtroom just as much as in a bedroom. We organized Know Your Rights workshops, explaining custody rights, restraining orders, and the process of pressing charges. We welcomed police officers for open forums, asking tough questions about why it took so long to investigate child abuse cases. We invited local judges to visit to see firsthand the children waiting for justice. And yes, some nights I would lie awake, haunted by the memory of Tony's Cadillac engine, humming like a predatory beast. I would wonder what happened to him once the law caught up, if it ever did. But I found solace in knowing that whoever knocked at our door with a frightened girl would find an answer, not a shrug. We had turned the failure of Oak Creek's system into a blueprint for protection. In the broader landscape of American justice, our approach was neither naive nor vengeful. We recognized the law's imperfections, its loopholes, its biases, its sluggish pace. But we refused to bypass it entirely. We believed that in the end, lasting change comes not from a single act of retribution, but from building structures that welcome the vulnerable, empower the weak, and hold the powerful accountable. Some will call this compromise. Others will say it's too cautious, too lawful. To them, I say, consider the alternatives. When we choose the forest over the path, we risk getting lost in our own righteous fury. When we build legal shelters instead of taking extrajudicial justice into our own hands, we create spaces where healing can begin long after the headlines fade. That was the turning point of my life. In choosing to respect the law, flawed though it was, I redrew the lines of what justice could mean. And in teaching girls to stand up for themselves through the system, I honored the promise I made that no one else should ever face the silence I did in Oak Creek. By the time 1985 rolled around, Sunrise House had outgrown our Lincoln Park residence. The spare room behind the store was now a full shelter that housed up to 30 girls at a time. We had added counseling offices, study nooks, and a bright communal kitchen that smelled always of cinnamon and fresh bread. On any given afternoon, you'd find teenage girls gathered around a table, working on resumes or practicing interview questions, while little ones colored in storybooks on a soft rug by the window. I'd stop by cup of tea in hand and ask how things were going. Mrs. Miller, I got into community college, one would say, eyes shining. Thank you for teaching me about setting boundaries, another would whisper, voice trembling. Those moments reminded me why I had chosen the law over vengeance, structure over chaos. Each girl who walked through our front door carried pieces of my own story, fear, shame, confusion. But they left with strategies to protect themselves, a support network to lean on, and most importantly, hope. Charlotte found her own calling in the early days of Sunrise House. Quiet and gentle, she became our resident art therapist. She'd guide girls through painting or sculpting, inviting them to express feelings they couldn't name. In those strokes of color, I saw scars lifting, anger, grief, loss, transforming into strength, resilience, creativity. Watching Charlotte, I realized that healing isn't linear. It's messy, layered like oil paint that takes time to dry, but once it does, forms something lasting and beautiful. Emily, youngest of us, thrived as Sunrise House's outreach coordinator. She was the one who organized our Know Your Rights fairs at local community centers. She spoke to neighborhood groups, churches, even police precincts, sharing the simple message: abuse thrives in the dark. We must shine a light on it. With her bright laugh and open heart, she recruited volunteers, fundraised through bake sales and benefit concerts, and built bridges with local schools so that teachers would know how to spot the signs. Emily's joy became our rallying cry. In 1992, after nearly 20 years away, I felt a need to return to Oak Creek. I boarded a Greyhound bus at dawn, watching the fields roll past until the dirt roads I remembered gave way to paved streets. The general store was gone, replaced by a modern shopping plaza. The church steeple still rose above the rooftops, but its windows were tinted now as if afraid to show what lay inside. My first stop was the old cemetery where my father's grave lay in an unadorned plot. I knelt before the simple headstone dates only no epitaph, and wondered if he had ever understood the depth of his betrayal. I found myself whispering, "I forgave you long ago," and meant it. Forgiveness wasn't for him, but for me to let go of the weight that had bowed my shoulders for decades. Then I visited Mrs. Gable, our old neighbor. In her tidy living room, she trembled when she saw me. "Abby, dear," she said, voice thick with tears, "you've become so strong." She confessed her remorse, how she heard me crying at night, but feared stepping in, how she told herself it wasn't her business. I took her hand and said, "You're not to blame. You did what you could then. Now we can do better." Her words spilled out like the opening of a dam. A librarian who remembered my blue-eyed mother admitted she always suspected something, but the town doctor's prescriptions kept the entire family under a veil of nervous illness. A former Sunday school teacher confessed she wrote in her journal about bruises, but dared not mention them in church. Each revelation was another thread in the tapestry of collective silence. Then I found Brenda, the dry goods daughter, whose confession I'd never forgotten. We met at a small cafe by the old train station. She trembled as she told me how she'd helped in our store, how my father had groomed her too, offering special favors in exchange for compliance. I was too ashamed to tell anyone, she whispered. I thought I was the only one. I took her hand and said, "You were never alone. Now we can tell your story too." In the years that followed, I returned occasionally, finding more pieces of the past hidden under Oak Creek's tidy surface. Neighbors who'd moved away sent letters describing how their own children had survived similar abuse. A retired nurse shared how she once patched up bruised bodies but never asked questions. Every confession deepened my conviction the real scars were not only on individual girls, but on the moral fabric of the community. Back in Chicago, I shared these stories at conferences, not to shame Oak Creek alone, but to illustrate a universal truth. abuse flourishes where silence reigns. I wrote papers for social work journals, spoke at university symposiums, and served on advisory boards for child welfare organizations. I emphasized the importance of coordinated responses, law enforcement, mental health professionals, educators, and community members working in concert. By 2005, Sunrise House expanded to Indianapolis with federal support and a team that included former residents who had returned as therapists and coordinators. We refined our model into 3 core pillars: immediate safety emergency shelter and protective orders collaboration with local law enforcement, trauma processing individual and group therapy, art and music therapy, peer support circles, future independence academic tutoring, vocational training, legal advocacy, and life skills workshops. Each chapter of Sunrise House bore the fingerprints of my own journey. The hidden ledgers became transparent records of accountability. The threat of darkness became open-door policies. The whispered fear became public mandates to act. On the occasion of our 30th anniversary in 2009, I looked out at a crowd of more than 200 past residents and supporters. Girls who had come to us at 12 now stood as lawyers, teachers, social workers, even elected officials. One by one, they took the stage to share how Sunrise House had changed their lives. The tears in the room were not of sorrow, but of triumph. Standing there, I saw Charlotte in the art station dusting glitter from her hands. I saw Emily organizing the next day's workshop schedule, cell phone in hand, eyes bright with purpose. I saw myself, the frightened 13-year-old who had learned to count money in secret, now counting the blessings of a community transformed. My story at its core was never about revenge. It was about creating alternatives, pathways out of silence, out of fear, out of brutality. I learned that true justice is not measured by retribution, but by restoration. When a girl finds her voice, when a family finds healing, when a community chooses intervention over ignorance, that is the victory I had always sought. Now, at 85, I sit on the porch of Sunrise House's main building and watch girls come and go. They laugh in the courtyard, balance textbooks, on benches, lean in during circle time under the maple trees. The scent of coffee and bread still lingers, but it's a promise of warmth, not a shroud of deception. If one lesson endures above all, it is this: every child's story matters. Every tear needs a listener. Every frightened girl deserves more than silence. Oak Creek was a chapter in my life, but not the ending. We have written new chapters, ones filled with action, empathy, and law upheld for the weak. So if you ever find yourself standing at a crossroads, uncertain whether to stay silent or to speak up, remember the girls of Sunrise House who chose courage. Remember the long road from darkness to dawn. And know that the smallest seed of resistance planted in good soil can grow into a refuge for an entire community.